is true, we know that it is, and we believe that it's true, but sometimes we're not 100% certain that we know exactly what that means. Most of the time, what we mean is the Book of Mormon is true because we feel that it teaches us true principles, and in our lives, it can help us, and it is absolutely true in that sense. That's the way most of us deal with the book. We read it and we look at it and we say, how does this apply to our lives? What I'd like to spend some time doing tonight is taking a little bit different perspective, put on a different set of eyes, and take a much more critical look at the book, not as how it applies to our lives, but as an historian would look at the book and say, what questions do we ask of this book if we look at it like any other ancient text that has ever been discovered in the world and presented to us? What do we know about it? What kinds of things can we ask? That process is going to require us to know something that we don't know, which is where the Book of Mormon took place. There is no official definition from the church that says this is where the Book of Mormon took place. We don't have the prophets saying this is exactly where you must believe that the Book of Mormon took place. And so that leaves the question to the scholars to get inside the book and start looking at it and saying, based on the information that's inside this book, what can we know? What I'm not going to do tonight is discuss a geographic theory about where the Book of Mormon is. We're going to start with one. We're going to start with the idea that the Book of Mormon took place in Mesoamerica, which is roughly from, let's say, somewhere around Mexico City down to probably the heel of the boot, if you know your geography of Mexico. So somewhere in that general vicinity, that's where the Book of Mormon took place. More specifically, the correlations moved down into southern Chiapas, and most of it seems to be taking place in the modern country of Guatemala, with a little bit in the southern part of Mexico. The reason I'm not going to argue that is we just don't have enough time. What we need to do is to use that information and then see if that's going to help us. Now, here's the next thing that you have to know about the issues. What we want to do is take a look at the difference in idea between saying, I want to examine the Book of Mormon as it appears in Mesoamerica, or saying, I want to examine Mesoamerican information as it shows up in the Book of Mormon. There's a huge difference in what you can do. If you say, I want to find the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica, you first have to go through the Book of Mormon and decide what it is that you might find. And of course, the only thing that we knew that we could find was they must have had baptismal fonts. And so high priest quorums forever have talked about all of the baptismal fonts that you find in anywhere in the New World. It's not a very productive way of looking at things. Here's the question for you. How many out here have read at least one of the Twilight books? See, I knew I'd get somebody who's read at least one of the Twilight books. Think about this issue. What would you say if someone said, I want you to find something in the Twilight books and find it in American culture? You'd go, okay, that's a little tough. Now, what if you said, I want to find something about Mormon culture and religion in the Twilight books? There are non-Mormons who are doing this, who are saying, well, the lady who wrote it was a Mormon, so therefore some of her beliefs must have informed something that's in the book. And so they're having a ball trying to find Mormonism in Twilight. And they can do it because there are some similarities in concepts. But that's exactly what we're going to try to do with the Book of Mormon. We want to find Mesoamerica in the Book of Mormon because if the people were real people and they lived at a real time and in a real place, and if it were that location, then naturally the things that they wrote about should reflect the culture that they lived in. Okay, all of us live in somewhere in the United States, right? How many of you, what's a good example? How many of you drive a Mormon car? Now, other than the fact that we all laugh about it and we know that vans are unofficially Mormon cars, there are other people who are not LDS who actually drive those things. Not very many, but there are a few. You cook with pots and pans. How many of them are stamped with seagulls on the bottom? We live our lives in a place, and we understand our lives based on the culture that we live in. And if we're going to describe something to someone, we describe it based on the understanding that we live in the same culture that they do. And so there are certain things that we do not need to explain. So, for instance, if I said that, that I rode here for 12 hours from Albuquerque, you would immediately assume that I came in a car and I wasn't riding a horse, because we know the culture. I did not say that, but I don't have to say that because we understand the culture. Now, here's the difference in the nature of what kind of texts we have. And as you go back with this idea of how do we look at things as an historian, you find that one of the differences is that you find a difference in the amount of descriptive material that you find in a text. There's two concepts. One's called a high context text, and one is a low context text. High context means that they tell you everything you need to know. A book about computers for dummies is a high context text because it assumes that you don't know anything, and so it tells you everything that it thinks you need to know. If you go to a computer science manual and you get a textbook for computer science, they presume there are certain things that you know. And if you do not know them and you try to read it, it's like reading a foreign language. You have no clue what they're talking about because you do not share the background. What happens in most cultural texts is that they are low context. In other words, they do not give you anything extra. They assume that you know the culture. So you'll get the information in the Bible, and the Bible is one of those cultures that simply presumes that you know what they're talking about. If we do not, and our culture is different from the culture that they're describing, we miss some really important things. Let me give you a couple of examples. Here's a good one. This one isn't from the Bible yet. I'll get to that one. But here's the idea. Let's say I've given a text and I translate it, and I don't know anything about the culture, so I just translate the information. And I write a sentence that says, "In came a man in a green-colored French peasant's cap." That's pretty clear, right? You know what I'm talking about. You can kind of visualize that this guy walks in wearing this thing, okay? What if I then translated it differently, knowing some more about the culture, and I said, "In walks a green beret"? All of a sudden, this is extremely different. There is a huge difference in understanding somebody wearing a green beret and somebody who is a green beret. Huge difference. Okay? Let me give you an example out of the Bible where exactly that difference comes up. There's a story in Numbers about Ehud, and they have this interesting statement in there, and it says, Ehud was a man left-handed, and then it goes on to tell about what he did. Why do we care? Is it really important that we know that he was left-handed? The answer is, yeah, as a matter of fact, it was, because it wasn't exactly left-handed that it said. It says that he was bound as to the right hand. Now, what that means is when they were training him, they would bind his right hand. He might have been naturally right-handed, but they bound it so that he could become much better with the left and could become a better warrior. In ancient battle, where you've got shields and swords, when you get two people who are right-handed next to each other, they know how to fight each other because they're familiar with this process. The left-hander is the one who has the advantage. It happens in the Aztec world that their most fierce fighters were always the ones who were left-handed. And so if they were having something that was going on and they were either tied or having a problem turning the tide of the battle, and they really needed to get somebody that could turn the tide for them, they sent in the left-handers. So when we find out that Ehud is a left-handed Benjamite, it isn't just odd information that they tossed in. If you know the culture, they're saying, this guy is a Green Beret. Oh, yeah. That makes a lot of difference in how we understand it. Now, here's another one out of the New Testament. I'll read this one to you because we always get this one wrong. We know in the New Testament that we are told to turn the other cheek, right? You've heard of this before. What we never remember is that we get that text wrong. It isn't turn the other cheek. Here's what it says. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And that's very specific. It doesn't say if they hit you on one cheek, turn them the other. It doesn't say that. It says if they smite you on the right cheek, turn the other one. Okay, why? Why does this make a difference? Why does knowing anything about the culture tell you something about that? Okay, well, think about it. You again take a right-handed person, because most people are, and if I'm facing somebody and I'm going to hit them on the right cheek with my right hand, how am I going to do it? My right hand is facing the left cheek. The only way I can do it is to backhand them. Well, the backhanded slap is an extreme insult that says that we are not equals. I am better than you are. And so what the Scripture is saying is don't resist evil. Don't get yourself in trouble and have this Roman kill you because you're resisting. You're living in a tough culture. But preserve what dignity you can. Don't accept the backhanded insult. Turn the other cheek and say, treat me like an equal, and slap me that way, and I may have to take it, but I'm going to take it as an equal, not an inferior. And all of a sudden, instead of saying this is a wimpy person that's just going to wait to get beat up, it's somebody who's saying, I'm going to stand up for myself. That's a huge difference in meaning. So the context is going to make a big difference in how we understand texts. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to say, let's assume that the Book of Mormon took place in Mesoamerica. We'll assume that John Sorensen and others have gone through and they've done all of the analysis and that this thing seems to work. And it does. It's really a pretty good correlation. Now we need to go to the next step, and we need to say, if the Book of Mormon took place there, does that cultural context tell us something about the Book of Mormon that otherwise we might not know? Can we learn something more than what's in the text based on the context? Let me give you a couple of them that come straight from the geography. In Mesoamerica, one of the things that lines up very nicely with the way the Book of Mormon is written, the Book of Mormon says that the Nephites are going to have to come in somewhere in the Southland, that somewhere up in the northern area you're going to have Jaredites, and that Mulekites are going to come in where the Jaredites are, and then they're going to come somehow probably up the river to get to Zarahemla, and they found Zarahemla. And then the Nephites come up from this location, and they find the Mulekites who are there in Zarahemla. And so we have a story in the Book of Mormon that gives us some very interesting spatial relationships. It says that you've got to have one culture here, you've got to have another old culture, older one up here, and somehow something up here's got to move down, these guys have got to move up. Then it tells us a couple of other things. It says it's got to happen somewhere around 200 BC. And the other thing it tells us is that when the people from the Nephites moved up into Zarahemla, that they couldn't understand the Mulekites. The Mulekites had lost their language. Now, here's what we never think about this, and this is where putting on the eyes of the historian says there's something wrong in the text. How is it that the Mulekites lost their language in 400 years? This should not happen. Let's see, how old is the United States? How long have we been around? Give us 300 years. Okay, not 400, 300. How many of you can read what the Founding Fathers wrote in the late 1700s? We can understand it, not a problem. How many of you can understand a document written in England at that same time? Now, we were split off from them. And, I can probably still go to England and understand pretty much everything except bonnets and boots. But in that length of time, you do not have a common language that becomes mutually unintelligible. It doesn't happen. But it did in the Book of Mormon. Why? Here's why. If you know the geography, you know what happened. First of all, if you have somewhere around 30 people who come in and they land in the coast of Guatemala, they move inland, they've got to figure out how to dress themselves, they've got to figure out where to find the clay to make pots, They have to figure out what the right food is to grow and how to grow it, because it's completely different foodstuffs. It's a different climate zone than where they came from. And there's a whole bunch of people who've already figured that out. Guess what they're going to do? They're going to learn from the people who are already there. This is the normal way that you have cultures merging. And when you have a brand new culture with only about 30 people, and they go into a culture that's got 2,000 or 3,000 that already knows what they're doing, guess which way the cultural information flows? It doesn't go from the Nephites to whoever else it was. It goes from them to the Nephites, because they're the ones who need to know. It also happens that even if you retain a scholarly language, that the common spoken language is the one that's spoken by the majority of the people. Okay, here's another one for you. What language do you speak? English. How long were the French in charge of England? A very long time. Long enough that we do have quite a few loan words from French in English. But the French court, there was a French-speaking court for a long time. It was the language of the higher-ups and the rulers in England. And we speak English. Why? Most people did. So what's going to happen with the Nephites when they come into this population is, even if they retain as a scholarly language whatever it is that they had as Hebrew at the time, they're going to end up on a daily basis speaking the language of the people around them. And if they come into that area down here in the south, they're going to speak some version of Mayan. That's what was there. Now, up at the top, the Jaredite level, in that area, they spoke at the time of the Jaredites a language that they call Miche-Soke, which is a combination of two words. What happened is there was one language and it split into two daughter languages. One of them was Miche and one of them was Soke. They didn't know what to call the combination of the two, so they called it Miche-Soke. So here's the Jaredites up here speaking Miche-Soke. At some point in time, there's a division, and there's an eastern and western division, and the Soke speakers are starting to move more in this direction. Mulekites come in, and they're up here in the Sokean speaking area. Then you have them coming up the Grijalva River Valley. Well, it just so happens in Mesoamerica that about 200 BC, Sokean speakers moved up the Grijalva River Valley up into that area. And there's evidence that some Maya speakers came up there as well in about 200 BC. What's going to happen if a Maya speaker and a Soke speaker get together? They will not understand each other because they're completely different languages. This is not French and Spanish. This is not Spanish and Italian. This is Basque and German. They're simply not going to be able to understand each other. So if you go to the history of what's happening in that location, exactly at the time the Book of Mormon says these people are meeting here and they can't understand each other, the history is telling us that right at that time, Soke speakers have moved into this area, Maya speakers come up, and if that were to happen, they wouldn't understand each other. So all of a sudden we can explain why the Mulekites lost their language. The Nephites lost theirs as well, but we always think it's the other guy that lost it. If you ask anybody nobody in the United States speaks with an accent except the other guy. Okay? And that's exactly what happens. The Nephites are going to say, hey, we understand each other, but we don't understand these guys. So that's what happened. So another one from geography. How is it that geography can explain other things that happen in the Book of Mormon? Here's another interesting one that solves the riddle of a very stupid story if you look at it through the eyes of the historian. If you look at it through the eyes of the historian, we have a really strange story when the people of Limhi are under the thumb of the Lamanites, and they're down here in city of Nephi area. They've left Zarahemla, they've come down here, and they've said, boy, this is really tough, it's time to get out of here. The Lamanites have really put heavy taxes on us, we want to get out of here. What we really want to do is ask these guys in Zarahemla to get an army and come down here and liberate us. That's what we want. And so they said, let's send a party to go find them. Now, there's the strange thing about it. It was their grandparents who had come from Zarahemla down here. Zarahemla's on the Sidon River. And so what they did is they come across the Sidon, they go up to the headwaters, they come down, they're back down into the valley of Nephi. And so when somebody says, okay, we're going to have to find Zarahemla, how do you find it? What's the map? How do you get there? the people knew, because it really wasn't that long ago that they'd done it. Their grandparents had actually done this. And so they had the instructions. They said, if you want to find Zarahemla, go find the River Sidon. Go down the River Sidon. You'll see it on the left. This is not hard. And these guys lost themselves. They missed it. They could not find it. Now you would think if they said go up to the mountains and start following the river, after about 8 or 9 days when you should have found it at 1 or 2, somebody would have noticed they hadn't seen a river yet. But they keep going. How is it that they are that stupid? Here's the answer. In the geography of that area, there's actually 2 rivers. There's the Grijalva and the Usumacinta. The Grijalva is the one that we think is the best candidate for the Sidon. And if you follow the Sidon, you will get to Zarahemla. If you follow the Usumacinta, you miss it because you're in the wrong river valley. The headwaters of those 2 rivers are 1 mile apart. They followed the wrong river. Do you know what happens if you follow the Usumacinta to its end, looking for Zarahemla that isn't there? You end up in Jaredite country, which is exactly what they did. So if you drop the Book of Mormon in that geography, all of a sudden the geography isn't an argument that we're making to say, yeah, it took place there. The geography is an argument saying, now we understand something about the Book of Mormon that we did not understand before. That is what we call being productive. If you have a correlation where the correlation starts telling you more than you would normally have known, that is a productive correlation because it tells you something you would not ordinarily know. Now, what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time with a text in the Book of Mormon, dropping an event into Mesoamerica and rereading the Book of Mormon for you in another context so that you can see how the context will tell us what's happening in the Book of Mormon. What we're going to look at is the context surrounding Benjamin's great speech. And we want to find out some new things about what Benjamin is doing. And the first piece of information that we have to go through, and you need to know about, is you've got to go to the Words of Mormon. And where do I want to go? I want to go to Words of Mormon, and of course there's only one chapter there. We want verses 14 to 18. And in the strength of the Lord they did contend against their enemies until they had slain many thousands of the Lamanites. And it came to pass that they did contend against the Lamanites until they had driven them out of the lands of their inheritance. And it came to pass that after there had been false Christs, and their mouths had been shut, and they had been punished for their crimes, and after there had been false prophets and false preachers and teachers among the people, and all having been punished according to their crimes, and after there having been much contention and many dissensions away unto the Lamanites, behold, it came to pass that King Benjamin, with the assistance of the holy prophets who were among the people, for behold, King Benjamin was a holy man, and he did reign over his people in righteousness, and there were many holy men. Anyway, it says he did... where's the one? Anyway, the result of all this is he has peace on the land. Okay? So there's the story. Here's the backstory on this. First of all, you have a war with the Lamanites and they beat them back. And then after that, you have problems. Now, we tend to lump all of these problems and say that the Lamanites caused them, but that isn't what the text tells us. It says, we beat back the Lamanites, and then we had problems. Now, they have some specific problems. One of them is they have false Christs. Well, you know, in New Testament times, you can get a false Christ because you already had one. How do you get a false Christ if Christ hasn't shown up? If you don't know enough about him to know who he is, how do you get a false one? Well, in the Book of Mormon, Christ, or the Messiah, is their God. And if you have a false Christ, you have a false God. Is there something in Mesoamerica that can tell us why we would have false gods and false prophets? And the answer is, absolutely, they're around all the time. In Mesoamerican religion, you would have what they call God impersonators. And it was the job of these men to dress up in the regalia of the god and to act as though they were that god, many times for an entire year at the time. And so you would have men going around saying, I am the God on earth, in these Mesoamerican religions. Where would they get this information from? Well, the Mulekites would have learned this kind of stuff from the Jaredites, and when they brought it with them down to Zarahemla, they had lost their religion, if you'll remember. Well, they lost their religion the same way they lost their language. They got a different one. And so what is being described to us is the conflict between the Nephite religion and these pagan religions that had shown up with the Mulekites at this point in time. Who are the false prophets? Well, they're the ones that are interpreting what these people say and handing out the information. When there are dissensions, why do they dissent unto the Lamanites? Why do they go to Lamanite territory? Well, Lamanites are enemies, and that's where everybody's going to go if they want to live this other religion. And so what's happening at this point in time is they're saying that during Benjamin, not only is there a war, but there's civil disputes among the Nephites, and they've now split, and they've purified the city, and they've sent all these people who believed in the wrong religion off to some other place, and they've gone to the Nephites, and now there's peace in the land because the people who couldn't accept Nephite religion have gone. There's the background that you're looking for. So against that background, now we have Benjamin who says, I'm going to give you a speech. Now, what is he doing? One of the things that King Benjamin is going to do is he's going to abdicate the throne. And he's going to give it to his son Mosiah. And then it says he lives for 3 years. This is the only case that I'm aware of in the Book of Mormon where a sitting king gives up the throne and hands it off to his son before he dies. Now, they might do it just on the deathbed, but everybody else is pretty much saying, okay, I'm going to die, you be king. And in this case, he says, well, I'm kind of old and I'm going to change things, but you be king. And then the guy lives for 3 years after that. So he wasn't on his deathbed. He's making a change. Why is he making the change? Well, the next thing that he's doing is he is also attempting to change the people. And what you'll find if you read through this particular sermon that Benjamin gives is that what he's doing is giving people a new name. Well, in the ancient world, when you got a new name, you just didn't get something new to be called. You got a new identity. If you are named something, then you are that kind of person. So when you have a new name, your entire identity is changed. And literally what he's saying is, we have had a divided nation, and what is happening, I'm going to bring you together, and you're no longer going to be Mulekites or Nephites. You're going to have one name. You're all going to be Christians. You're all going to follow God, all of you. We're going to change that name. Now, again in the context, let's go to some of the things that he says in his speech. Let's see. Where do I want to go? Mosiah 2:7. For the multitude being so great that King Benjamin could not teach them all within the walls of the temple, therefore he caused a tower to be erected, that thereby his people might hear the words which he should speak unto them. You've heard that before. King Benjamin builds a tower. We all know about this. King Benjamin builds a tower. You see pictures of it, this nice wooden tower. In the eyes of an historian, this is a weird story. It shouldn't happen. Later in the Book of Mormon, his son Mosiah speaks to more people, because it says that there's a greater number of people at the time. His son speaks to a lot more people, and it never says he built a tower. So his son speaks to more people, but the daddy can't. Secondly, it is inside the walls of the temple, and then he builds it. Next thing is, he didn't plan to. This wasn't what he thought was going to happen. He was surprised. More people showed up than he thought they would. And he said, oh, darn, they're not going to hear me. I'll build a tower. So how is it that the tower is important for Benjamin and isn't important for Mosiah? Well, if you are inside the walls of a temple inside of Mesoamerica, you are standing somewhere near the foot of a Mesoamerican temple or a pyramid temple. And what every Mesoamerican culture has done to speak to the people is walk up the steps of the pyramid. And they were actually pretty good acousticians. In Chichen Itza and in Tikal, you can go up to some of these towers and stand up on the steps and speak in a normal tone of voice, and everybody out in the plaza can hear you. They were very good at doing this. And so if you wanted to speak to a lot of people, you would walk up the steps. I will guarantee you that the pyramid was there when Mosiah spoke, and he just walked up the steps and did what you normally do. Why wasn't it there when Benjamin was there? Well, we don't know for certain. This is speculation, but I'll give you speculation because it's darn fun speculation. Temple wasn't there. Now, in the city that John Sorensen suggests might be Zarahemla, which is Santa Rosa, currently underwater with the dam project, so we can't do any more excavating there. But there is a temple that, according to the pottery sequences, appears to have been built somewhere in the ballpark of 200 BC. You can't date it precisely, but seems to be about 200 BC. When the non-Mormon archaeologist was excavating this temple, he gets down to the bottom floor, and you have to understand that what they cared about on these temples was the outside, not the inside. This isn't an Egyptian pyramid where the inside is intricate with all the traps and everything. There was trash on the inside. They just put rocks and pots and anything they can do to pile up the junk, and then they put the nice facing stuff on the outside so it looked pretty, because it was the outside that they cared about. So you get down to the bottom, and down at the very bottom, unlike most of the temples that they've excavated, they found a plaster floor. You don't need a plaster floor in most of these because you're going to pile junk on top of it. In this one, there was a plaster floor. So they said, okay, let's excavate the plaster floor. And after they get through excavating the plaster floor, they find that there are two different types of pebbles that are in the fill for this bottom rung, or the bottom level of the temple. One of them are smooth river stones, and the other is sharp-edged gravel. And they are arranged on an east-west side so that the line between them follows the northwest or the north-south axis. So they lined these things up with the stars and said, there's the north-south axis. On this side, smooth stones. This side, sharp rocks. None of the sharp rocks are in with the smooth stones. None of the smooth stones are in with the sharp rocks. So the non-Mormon archaeologist is looking at this and he says, okay, what in the world were they doing? He says, here's a guess. He says, I'm guessing that at this point in time, there were probably two different peoples that came together and decided to make a covenant. They were all one people, and so they represented the two different people by the two different stones, plastered it all over, and made one temple out of it to signify that they were all one people. And that would be a real good reason why the temple wasn't there when Benjamin needed to speak and had to build a tower, and his son did not. Okay. Yeah, we got a few more. Still in Benjamin. Here's some more fun stuff in Benjamin. Yeah, we're going to read from 10 to 13. I'm probably stopping a lot while I'm doing it. Benjamin starts speaking to them, and in verse 10 he says, I have not commanded you to come up hither that you should fear me, or that you should think of myself, or that I of myself am more than a mortal man. That's a really weird way to start. What would you have thought if I'd have come in here and said, by the way, I just want to let you know I'm a mortal man? You'd look like I was nuts. You're going, well, yeah, of course you are. Why would I say that? Well, we have a history of saying that there are divine kings around, and so we assume maybe that must be what it was, because we know that from the old world. In the New World, it was literally true, and there were kings who were considered divine. And at this particular point in time, the concept of the divine king in the Maya area was really taking off. And this concept of becoming a king and having a stratified society was the thing that was going on in the culture area at the time. So when he starts off and he says that, he starts off with this series of negative comments about what he isn't. And the only reason for starting with those is because he's going to make a contrast to something that he could have been. And he's saying, I'm not like the other guys. And it only makes sense if they knew that there was somebody else that was making the claim. Without somebody else who was claiming to be divine, Benjamin's statement makes no sense whatsoever. Then he continues, but I am like as yourself, subject to all manners of infirmities in mind and body. So, I'm human, not the deity that these other guys are saying they are. Yet I have been chosen by this people and consecrated by my Father and was suffered by the hand of the Lord that I should be a ruler and a king over this people. So he says, I am the king, but I'm human. And contrasted to somebody else. Verse 12. I say unto you that as I have suffered, that as I have been suffered to spend my days in your service, even up to this time, and have not sought gold nor riches nor any manner of riches of you. Okay. Again, think about what's happening here. He's giving them a negative comment. By the way, when you came in, I did not charge you $50. Why would I say that? It only makes sense if there's a context in which somebody might have. And in this case, he's saying, I didn't ask gold and silver of you like the other guys you know who do. Same kind of thing goes with the next set. Neither have I suffered that ye should be confined in dungeons, nor that ye should make slaves of one another, nor that ye should murder or plunder or steal or commit adultery. Nor have I suffered that ye should commit any manner of wickedness. And again, go back to, me walking in here and say, by the way, when you came in here, I did not require any of you to kill anybody else who was here. Why would you say that? The only reason he's saying that is that in this context, these were things that happened. The people that he was talking to were familiar with kings who did these things. Now, it also turns out that if you read the Book of Mormon with these eyes of the historian and you drop it into the cultural context of Mesoamerica, some of these words actually turn out to be kind of code words that appear to be Joseph Smith's way of describing something that was rampant in Mesoamerica. For instance, we see murders all of the time in context where our understanding of the word murder simply doesn't apply. How is it that Benjamin is saying, I haven't suffered you to commit murders? Well, in the context of Mesoamerica and in the other places where we see that context in the Book of Mormon, it appears to be talking about human sacrifice. Places where they were killing a human being. And he's saying, we're not doing that. The next one is the plunder. Mesoamerican cities would increase their stature and increase their wealth by conquering another city and imposing a tribute on them. And they would say, and you'll remember the case of Zeniff and Noah and then Limhi, where the Lamanites said, yeah, you can stay here, but pay. They would do that with other cities, and that's how they got where they were. And this concept of plundering, if you go through the Book of Mormon, is the way that the Book of Mormon describes that particular facet of Mesoamerican culture. And so it's another one of those things where the culture is telling us that these words have meaning in that area. And so when Benjamin is saying to them, I haven't had you do this, he's saying, I have not set you up to be the same kind of city that everybody else is. All right. We've got just a little bit more time. I can tell you one more story. Tyler, should we do Ammon or should we do the anti-Nephi Lehis? Anti-Nephi Lehis. Okay. These are my two favorite stupid stories in the Book of Mormon. And I say it that way lovingly because we all read them and we think these are wonderful stories until you look at them with the eye of the historian. You look at them, with this very dispassionate idea and you said, okay, what's really happening there? If I strip away all of the things that sound faith-promoting, they really are dumb stories. Until you drop them in the cultural context. Anti-Nephi Lehis, a really interesting group of people. These people convert to the Lord and they say that converting to the Nephite religion was the hardest thing that they have ever done. And one of the things that they're going to do now is they're going to give up fighting. And so they're not going to do war anymore. And so they're going to take all their weapons of war and they're going to bury them. So then people come in, and these are the guys who are the rulers of this particular city. Somebody else comes in and says, well, okay, we're going to take over because we don't like what you're doing. We're going to be the kings of the city. And so they come in and they start fighting them. And because the anti-Nephi Lehis are not going to fight anymore, They lay down their lives, and the people eventually get tired of killing somebody who isn't fighting back, and then they said, yeah, darn, this isn't any fun anymore, and so they stop. But they say, I don't want to kill you anymore, but I really want to kill somebody. And I'm not really through killing yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a 3-day hike up the coast, and I'm going to go to the city of Ammonihah, and I'm just going to kill them. So they do. And it's the only time in the Book of Mormon where we see them bringing back captives. Every other time, when the Lamanites go out to conquer a city, they go out to conquer a city, and they put them under a tribute status so that they can get the money back. In this case, they don't even do that. They don't bother. They just go out, kill a few people, grab some captives, and head back home. Because they, I guess, still wanted to kill people. So then they get home, and the anti-Nephi Lehis say, this is probably a clue that we should get out of here. So they leave, and they go to Zarahemla, and they show up in Zarahemla, and the people in Zarahemla said, welcome, we'll give you a land over here by the people of Gideon, you can farm it, and we'll put you in a safe place because we know you're not going to fight anymore, and now that you're in a safe place, we can protect you. Unfortunately, that safe place was really by the Zoramites, and the Zoramites turned, and all of a sudden these guys are in trouble again, and there's a huge war that's being fought on 2 different fronts, and the Nephites are really in trouble now. And the people of anti-Nephi Lehi say, oh man, you guys need help. We actually know how to fight, so maybe we should do that, but boy, if we do that, we could lose our souls. And we won't do that. We're not going to do that. We're not going to fight. But we've got a great idea. Let's have our 12 and 14-year-old sons go out and do it for us. Let's take the deacons. And we'll take the deacons and we'll give them a shield and a sword and we'll say, you guys go fight. I'm going to stay here and farm. How's that? This is weird. How does this happen? How in the world do you ever get pacifist parents who think it's a great idea to send 12 and 14-year-old sons off to war? It doesn't make sense. Now, let me drop it into Mesoamerican culture and give you some background on what's happening here. They say that they are murderers. Every single one of them. The anti-Nephi Lehites say, we have been murderers. Now, when would the children have murdered anyone? When would the women have murdered anyone? Even the warriors, if you're fighting in battle, every human population manages to define war in such a way that we're not murdering anyone. We're killing an enemy or doing something else. That isn't murder. They deserved it after all. So it can't be explained by warfare. It's something else. If it is, as I suspect, human sacrifice, they're saying we had to give up a religion that was focused on human sacrifice. Human sacrifice came through warfare. And in Mesoamerica, warfare was intimately connected with the practice of human sacrifice. So they're saying that when we changed religions, we had to get rid of all of the things that led us to the ancient religion, including anything that would make us have the feelings that we felt when we were in a position where we wanted to sacrifice a human being. And like an alcoholic making sure they abstain from drink, they said, if we don't fight, we won't have those feelings, and we won't be destroying our souls because we're doing that. Why do they bury the weapons? If I bury $1 million in my backyard, and all of a sudden the stock market crashes, not that it would, but if it did, I think I'd go dig it up. And if they bury these things, why don't they dig it up? First of all, why do you bury it in the first place? Okay? Well, it turns out that there's a Mesoamerican tradition of caching goods that you give to the gods. And when you make a commitment to the gods, you will bury the offering in the earth. And what it doesn't say, and again you'll remember that they don't always tell you everything because they assume you know. Most of the times when you cached an object in Mesoamerica, you broke it first. So they broke the weapons and buried them. Why didn't they dig them up? They were broken. They were not things that you could go get again because you had symbolically broken them to witness that you were giving them over to God. So that's why they buried them. By the way, it has nothing to do with burying the hatchet. For those people who think that it's related to the tomahawk and burying the hatchet, no relationship whatsoever. Okay, the Lamanites come in and they start killing people. The real clue to the story here is that they're trying to become kings. And when you are trying to become the king, there is a tradition in Maya culture of how you become a king. And one of the things that you must do in order to become a king, in order to be seated as the king, is you must sacrifice people who have been captured in combat. Guess what didn't happen with the anti-Nephi Lehis? They didn't fight back. So they couldn't be the captives that would seat the king. So when they finish killing them and they say, I still want to kill somebody else, it wasn't because they wanted to kill somebody. They need captives in battle. They didn't have any. They're trying to seat a new king, and they needed captives. And they did what every Mesoamerican king did. They went to some unsuspecting town that doesn't know that they're coming, raid the dar thing so that they get an easy battle, take the captives and bring them back. Why is it that this is the only time in the Book of Mormon that they're bringing captives back? Because they need them to seat the king. Why is it that the people said, I cannot fight, but my sons can? Because the sons had not ever participated in that culture. They took the ones who were young enough that they had never been part of that religion. They would be able to fight with a pure heart and not think of the other religion. They could do it, the parents could not. So for that reason, the parents said, we can send our sons and we can't go. So if we take this context and we drop the story into the context of that area of the world, it starts to make sense in ways that it cannot make sense if we look at it dispassionately as an historian. And the rest of the Book of Mormon is working that same way. When you find the correct context and the correct culture, it automatically becomes the missing context that they don't tell you about. And it becomes productive in that it begins to tell you things that you would not otherwise have known. The one thing that it cannot do is it cannot tell us the one thing that we have already known, which is that the Book of Mormon is true. Even with all of this information, the Book of Mormon was true before we learned it. The Book of Mormon is true now. The difference is not that the Book of Mormon is or is not true, but if we can read it against a cultural context, we can appreciate those people better. We can understand them better as real human beings. We can understand their motivations. We can understand why they did things. And by understanding those things, perhaps then we can understand a little bit better how to apply those same things to our own lives. I bear you my testimony that I know the Book of Mormon is true. I absolutely love the text. I love finding out some of the other things that are going on behind it. But above and beyond everything else, it's true because the Holy Ghost says that it's true. There isn't anything that any scholar is going to tell you that could possibly make it any truer than what the Holy Ghost will witness to you. I bear you that witness in Jesus' name, amen. I get to stay here.
This is the question and answer time. This is when you get to try to
stump
Brant. I'll open the floor if anybody has any questions.
The concept of Mennonite is a universal tribe. Now, that's probably not what was actually in Mesoamerica at the time. There were probably unique tribes, but they were all branded as Mennonite. How does that work out with this text?
The most important thing to know about Lamanites is that it really isn't a tribe at all. It is a collective socio-political designation. And Nephite isn't a tribe. Although there were tribes of Nephites and there were tribes of Lamanites and Lemuelites. The terms Nephite and Lamanite are political associations. And you can be a Lamanite and become a Nephite just by switching cities and switching your allegiance. You can be a Nephite and become a Lamanite just by saying, dang, I don't want to stick around with these Nephites anymore. I want to fight against them, so I'll go over here and I'll be a Lamanite. You cannot change your tribal affiliation. So your genetic inheritance, your tribal inheritance, all of that stays the same. But the way that the people in the Book of Mormon move in and out tells us that what's really happening is that these are socio-political designations. Probably the easiest way to understand them is very much like Jew and Gentile. You are either a Jew or you're a Gentile. Now, you could be a Moabite, you're still a Gentile. You could be a Babylonian, you're still a Gentile. So it's just that major difference between us and them. The other piece of information that's kind of interesting, a lot of people will say, well, the Book of Mormon never talks about other nations like you get in the Bible. They'll talk about the Egyptians, and they'll talk about, somebody else. The difference is that in Mesoamerica, there were really no nations. There were conglomerations of cities. And so the way they would designate themselves is by their city. It is much closer, if you think about it, and if you know anything about Greek history, it's closer to the Greek idea, where you were a Spartan or an Athenian. Yeah, you were both Greeks, but you were either a Spartan or Athenian. And when you spoke of someone, it was about Sparta or about Athens. In the Book of Mormon, you get the same thing. Somebody is part of that city. And so they're a Lamanite, like there was a Greek, but the real designation that they care about isn't the king of this whole thing. It's the city you belong to.
Next.
In the Book of Mormon, there is the people who are keeping the records are really concerned about not letting those fall into the wrong hands and having them be destroyed. About 8 months ago, I was reading a book about the Cortez and his conquest of Mexico, and I read that it was a common thing for if one group was conquering another group, they would come in and they would destroy all their records. Is that a valid connection between the Book of Mormon and Mesoamerica, something that was happening in a cultural context?
Yeah, and you'd find that kind of thing pretty much throughout the world. One of the ways that you can conquer someone and remove their identity is to remove their history and remove their writings. Even more so when you get to Mesoamerica and they are not as literate a population, don't have as large a collection of the writings, particularly much earlier. So losing your records is tantamount to losing your identity, and a very good reason why the Nephites would want to keep them. You'll notice that one of the things that the Nephites do as they move from king to king is they create a set of sacred symbols that moves with the king. The sword of Laban is one of them, the Liahona is one of them, and the brass plates. Now, the rest of the plates are things that are passed on as historian, but the sacred set are the brass plates. And interestingly enough, most of the time that you are quoting something that they consider to be scripture, it's brass plates and not these other sets of plates that we would consider scripture because of the Book of Mormon. They considered them more history. But they still wouldn't want to lose them. Yes?
You probably familiar with the theory put forth to the Book of Mormon.
Yes.
It's also Phil Shin along with all that. Can you address that?
Joseph Smith retrieved the plates that he used to translate the Book of Mormon from a Drummond in New York, deposited there by Moroni. We absolutely know that that happened, and so there's no question. Somewhere along the time in history, several of the early saints said, wow, plates were buried in the hill Cumorah. Therefore, since we got plates out of this little hill in New York, I bet it was the hill Cumorah. And so they made the association, and as soon as they made the association, it became very popular, entered into everybody's thought, and from that point on, it was the hill Cumorah, and New York had a hill Cumorah. There was no hill Cumorah in New York prior to probably 1831. Book of Mormon comes out in 1830. There is no hill Cumorah there. There's just the hill where you got the plates. There's the sacred hill. But once it became named as Cumorah, then everybody knew that that's where the place was. And one of the reasons that they did that is because they knew that in the Book of Mormon it said that plates were buried in Cumorah. Unfortunately, they didn't read the Book of Mormon very carefully because Mormon said that he buried all the plates in that hill except the ones he gave Moroni. So whatever got buried in the hill Cumorah was anything but what was taken out of the hill in New York. So we don't have any good textual reason for saying it, and there was the historical reason why it came up. Now, why is there a theory that there might be two of them instead of one? There's, obviously the New York Hill. If you are going to look for a geography of the Book of Mormon and find something that's consistent, you have to do several things. One of them is you have to look very carefully at what the text says, because the text is the authority on where it took place. You examine that by looking at topology, you're looking at overall structure of the lands, you're looking at the hydrology of where the rivers go, you're looking at climate, you're looking at a whole number of things. But one of the things that you're looking at is distance. And they don't do a really good job of telling us about distance in the Book of Mormon. You have to kind of work at it. But they do give us a clue that allows us to calculate plausible distances in the Book of Mormon. They tell us how long it took to get from one place to the other. It's so many days' journey. And so if you take a day's journey as a marker and you say, okay, how far are you going to travel in a day? That's going to start to give you a range of distances. And that kind of depends on the factors that you put in. But pretty much any reasonable number that you put in cannot get you from anywhere in Mesoamerica up to New York in anything that's described in the Book of Mormon. You just can't get there in time. Now, Moroni never tells us how long it took him to get there, so the fact that Moroni could have taken them there doesn't tell us anything at all. What we do know is that the Jaredite hill and the Nephite hill, where they were both wiped out, are the same one. So if the Jaredite hill is very close to where everything else happens in Mesoamerica, then the Nephite hill has to be in the same place. So they call it a two Cumorah theory because of the one in New York and the other one. It's sort of like there's a York, England, and there's a New York in the state of New York, and namesakes. Yes?
Two questions. One, just curiosity and speculation. The other, more curious. Curiosity, what kind of the alphabet, manner of writing do you think was sufficiently in vogue in 600 BC that they would have brought across that could be named Egyptian? It wasn't Hebrew characters, but some other sort of characters. So that's just curiosity, what you speculate on that. And then the other thing is, in what seems to be our modern culture of the importance of authority, it seems to me that so many people feel like they're not allowed to ask questions of the text, because somehow that questioning an authority, when it seems that your position is that you're supposed to ask questions of the text. You're supposed to teach you. If you don't ask questions, you can't teach you. But how do you even start to explain the difference between historical, cultural context and that God uses men to do work, real, actual mortal men found in space and time and culture, to people who feel like it's Scripture, it's the mind of the Word, the voice of the Lord, and if you ask it, if you say, in your own words, there's something wrong with the text.
Yeah, I get in trouble when I say that.
How do you even start to approach that? It seems to be a cultural difficulty.
Let me start with the purely speculative one. First of all, by starting by saying none of us know. So, yeah, we're definitely speculating here. I strongly suspect that there was a shift in the writing system as it moved from the old world to the new. Once you start speaking another language that has certain structures in it that are not represented in the language that you came from, you have to find some way to represent them. And so your script is going to have to change. So I suspect strongly that it changed after it hit the New World. Clearly the brass plates did not. But whatever it was, there was something that Moroni, both Mormon and Moroni would still understand near the end because they could read the small plates that Nephi had written. And I don't think he changed that much that fast. So some Paleo-Hebrew was probably kept as a scholarly language unless they adapted things very quickly. which is possible. But exactly what it looked like, don't know. The only thing I can tell you is that it wasn't called Reformed Egyptian until very late. Early on it's called Egyptian, and Mosiah tells his sons that they have to become educated so that they can learn Egyptian and they can read the things. I also strongly suspect that Egyptian doesn't mean what we think it means sometimes. I think it's a larger, wider category of things. And even at that point in time, Egyptian would cover at least the hieroglyphs and Demotic. I'm not sure about the hieratic was around at the time. So the
And hieratic and Demotic were the two that are better options.
more likely, yeah, the glyphic language probably is not the one that was being used. It's either Demotic or hieratic, which are more cursive ways and much more simple ways of writing the language. So much closer to that. As for the second question, it really is just a question of time. We just have to keep talking. How do you tell somebody else who gets really nervous if I say, "Oh, that was a mistake," or "That's really a weird story," which, by the way, I do on purpose because otherwise you don't listen to me. If I can at least shock you, you wake up enough to listen, and maybe you can figure out the answer. But if that's really upsetting to someone, you don't try to change them. You let time take care of that. Their faith is much more important than any of the rest of this that we could talk about, and you preserve the faith first. Yeah. Oh, yeah, okay.
Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, then we'll go back to him.
My question is that these people who are really dealing with human sacrifices that early, like when Hananiah was destroyed. And I don't know if I remember correctly, but it seems to me that he said everyone was killing it and the whole city was destroyed. But what I'm wondering is, I know that we read books about these people that are moving through Mexico and Central America, that after what they call the Nazi period, there was a war culture that moved in. And everything depicts that war culture from then on. And I'm wondering if that was possibly the late arrival.
Not that late. No, it's actually starting much earlier. In Mesoamerican history, warfare was always there. But probably not large-scale warfare until you get somewhere around 200 BC. From 600 to 200 BC, you're getting tribal warfare. So there's warfare, but there's not much. And interestingly enough, what you see in the Book of Mormon is some warfare, but you don't get the big descriptions of battles, big wars. You do get the indication that something is happening. But it follows very much the trajectory of Mesoamerican history. When they start making cities and having kings and differentiating the societies hierarchically, then you're starting to get more organized warfare, and that's starting about that time period. It intensifies in time until, oddly enough, you hit somewhere around the time of Christ. And somewhere around the time of Christ, particularly in the Grijalva River Valley, which is where we think the Sidon was, there's a hiatus, and there is what they call a mini collapse, and people seem to be leaving the area. And if you think about what happens historically, if you've got a whole bunch of people leaving the area, they're not in conflict anymore. They're probably not fighting with anybody anymore. They're probably living in peace. And maybe one of the reasons they're living in peace is because all the unpeaceful people have left and they've gone somewhere else. But, even at that time period, this mini collapse corresponds with the time period in the Book of Mormon that says that we're not having, a lot of conflicts. What then happens in the Book of Mormon is it says somewhere around the end of 300 years after Christ and getting into 400 years after Christ, things not only start heating up again, but they really get different. And Mormon complains that warfare has changed. And if you look at the way Mormon describes it, and Mormon has spent a long time in the Book of Alma talking about wars. He never describes anything in the Book of Alma or Helaman in the pejorative terms that he does the wars that are happening in his days. And basically says, oh man, this is bad stuff. They're sacrificing women and children now. We never used to do that. And you look at what he's doing, and he says warfare has changed for the worse, and now it's destructive. 378 AD, there is a record in Tikal that spear thrower Owl comes probably from Teotihuacan and shows up in Tikal and enters the city, which is a euphemism for conquer. And at that point in time, Tikal shifts and is not necessarily so much Maya as it becomes Teotihuacanized, and it starts representing more of these people coming from central Mexico. It turns out that the people from central Mexico about this time are coming down into the Maya area, and one of the things that happens according to the Maya records is a dramatic increase in warfare and a change in the nature of warfare. It becomes different because the Teotihuacanos have shown up. So again, right at the time period that Mormon is saying bad things are happening and war just isn't like it used to be in the good old days, the Teotihuacanos have come down and they have done exactly that in the historical record at exactly the same time period that the Book of Mormon says those changes are taking place. Yes?
My question was with the Mulekites. Orson Eckhart proposed a theory that it could be a way of bringing two people together without there ever being a Mulek that came across in the old world. What's your take on that?
It's a fun theory and interesting to think about, and it has some plausibility, but absolutely no textual evidence. So if you want to build a house of cards, if you will, I'm sorry. You can do it and it's interesting, but you can't say that that is the solution to what's happening because the text just doesn't say that. So, yeah, maybe, but no evidence for it. It's just as easy to believe that they did as that they didn't. And since the text said they did, you kind of have to take it as its word. Yeah.
In the city-states that exist in Mesoamerica, they have three gods, right? There are three gods that are kind of the patrons of the city.
In Palenque, yeah, not all of them. Yeah.
Some have one god, some have several.
Yeah, and even in Palenque, they've got more. There's a triad of gods, but there are other gods hanging around.
So, I guess my main question is, how does belief in the Trinity, as Christians understand it, translate into a city-state? And then, were there many cities that had the exact same God as their patrons? It seems kind of messy to me. How does that work?
Doesn't? I would be very suspicious of anybody who said that there was any kind of triune concept that left the Nephites and went to the Lamanites and shows up in later Maya culture. I think you have lots of other reasons for saying why the triad of gods show up. Probably the most logical is in Maya culture, one of the really most foundational things that you can do is cook food. And the symbol of the home, the symbol of earth, the symbol of everything that's good is the cooking fire. And the cooking fire was always traditionally created with 3 stones. And so you would have 3 stones that you put around the fire so that you would balance your pots on top of the 3 stones. And the 3 hearth stones are the symbol of creation. I suspect that when you get a triune god in Palenque, it's much more likely to be related to the hearth of creation than it is anything out of the Book of Mormon. If you look at the Book of Mormon, you will be hard-pressed to find very much information that clarifies a triune Godhead. You don't even really completely see the separation of the Father and Son until after Christ appears. And then, of course, you have to impute it from the fact that the Holy Ghost has shown up. But I'm not sure that they understood the Holy Ghost as well as we do. Yes?
2 questions. First, you've given us a number of examples where the things correlated with what was actually happening in Mayan culture. And one of the prominent things in the Book of Mormon is the pride cycle. just constant up and down, up and down. Have you ever looked at that and seen if that similar correlation takes place there? And the second question is generally, why so much war in the Book of Mormon? I mean, we've learned things from it. Obviously, there's spiritual lessons beyond from it, but why do you think there's so much war in the Book of Mormon?
That's part of it, yeah. You told me I could take time, right? Okay. Starting off with pride cycle stuff. I see the pride cycle very differently than I think the Nibley did, where it's classically defined. What happens in Nephite culture, as I see it, is that they tried very hard to establish an egalitarian community. The foundational documents of Nephi politics are Isaiah. And Isaiah says, let's not deal with the hierarchy and everything else. Let's get it to the people, and everybody has a right to the land, and let's be equal. And you get Benjamin, who is saying, I'm working with my own hands here. You don't want, other places where he says, you don't want to exalt yourself over someone else. So the Nephite ideal is to be egalitarian. All of the cultural pressures around them is for social stratification. And what happens frequently is they give in to it. They start believing what Madison Avenue is telling them. You know, they start watching TV, and pretty soon they just got to have the same clothes and the same cars that everybody else does. So that happens, and at some point in time, the crash comes, and the prophets say, hey, you know, you need to get back to the roots and go back to your egalitarian society. You don't see a lot of that in the rest of Mesoamerica, because the rest of the Mesoamerica was the Madison Avenue that was preaching all this stuff, and they collapsed for other reasons. The entire idea that you would have an egalitarian community instead of a socially ranked community are antithetical ideas. And when you see in the Book of Mormon, when they say, if the Nehorite religion becomes the religion of the Nephites, it will destroy our religion. You know, even in Utah, there are other religions here. You know, I'm in Albuquerque, which is heavily Catholic. Living there hasn't destroyed my religion. You know, we actually have several wards, lots of stakes. The fact that there are other religions in the area has not destroyed our religion. But in the Book of Mormon, they always say, if the Nehorites get their way, it will destroy our religion. And that's because along with religion comes the ranked society, which is antithetical to the way that they're trying to develop it. And you cannot have a ranked society and an egalitarian society simultaneously. They can't coexist. So in the Book of Mormon, that's why that fear is there. It really is going to destroy them. Next question. Why is there so much warfare in the Book of Mormon? Well, there's so much warfare at the end of Alma because Mormon was just in love with Captain Moroni. He thought he was the best thing that had ever happened. Mormon was a military man. He appreciated it. He probably went a little bit overboard in describing Captain Moroni. He attributes probably every military advance that happened over 300 or 400 years to Captain Moroni. I would bet that, like people study Sun Tzu now, that people studied Captain Moroni. So you get a lot of that because of what he's doing. But that isn't the explanation for warfare in the Book of Mormon. Mormon wrote a very careful text. And his text says, and if you really want to know what Mormon's doing, you have to read the title page of the Book of Mormon. It says, to the convincing of the Jew and the Gentile, that Jesus is the Christ. That's what you're supposed to do. Now, how is he going to do that? Well, he could have preached one big long sermon and said, there. And it would have saved us all a lot of reading. But he didn't. And the reason he didn't is that ancient historians had a different scientific method. Their scientific method wasn't the kind that we're used to. Their scientific method was history and story. And you told the story, and by telling the story, you could see what was going to happen. Why? Because history was cyclical. In the modern world, we think that it's kind of linear, and that, what happens here is not necessarily what happens way out here. But they were cyclical, and they figured that what happened is going to happen. And so if Mormon could tell the story and could show us the patterns of what happened in the story, we would see what was going to happen. So what he does is he takes this text, and if you think about what he was originally going to write, you've got the book of Lehi. And the book of Lehi covered 116 manuscript pages, but it only got up to about 200 BC. So that's not a lot. You're covering 400 years this time period. Then as you get into the book of Mosiah, time starts to slow down, and he spends more time on fewer years until you get to the time of Christ, and you have the book of 3rd Nephi, where the vast majority of the book of 3 Nephi covers 3 days. And so what he does is he condenses time, and he says, okay, we'll start off here, and then as we get closer and closer and closer, we'll slow down, and then we'll just get here and we'll really concentrate on what happened. Then he has several other patterns that he throws into it. One of them is that he knows that before the Messiah comes, there should be, according to the Scriptures, wars and rumors of wars. So guess what he starts telling us before Christ comes? He makes sure that we know that there were wars and rumors of wars. You get it a little bit as it's required early, but you really see it as it comes closer to the time of Christ. 2 other things that he says are part of his pattern. One of them is that Gadianton robbers show up, and the other is that Gadianton robbers destroy society. And what he makes sure that we understand, starting in the book of Helaman, is that the Gadianton robbers show up right before Christ. They kind of wane in and out for a while, but right before Christ they come back, and because they're there, Nephite society is destroyed. And we kind of forget this, but you remember this is when they break up into tribes. If you're broken up into tribes, you're not a Nephite culture anymore. You're individual tribes. And so, in essence, Nephite culture has been destroyed prior to the time that Christ comes. And so according to Mormon, you have wars, rumors of wars, the Gadiantons show up, and the Nephites are destroyed. And then the Messiah comes. Then the Messiah comes in the Book of Mormon, and right after that, Mormon sticks in this wonderful book of 4th Nephi, where you whip through about 400 years and 66 verses. Lightning fast. And he does it in a way that basically doesn't tell you anything. This is a book about nothing. There is no information in the book of 4th Nephi. The book of 4th Nephi is the only book in the Book of Mormon that never quotes the large plates. There are no sermons there. Now, can you imagine this? You've got this people that is living in peace and harmony for 200 years, and nobody gave a good sermon? There wasn't a single prophet that said anything worth recording? Couldn't have happened. But Mormon didn't care. Rushes through the 400 years. What happens when he gets to his book? The Gadiantons show up, there's wars and rumors of the war, and the Nephites are destroyed. Guess what he's telling us? He said, this Christ, the eternal God, came, and this is the pattern. And the pattern's repeating, and you may know that he will come again. And that's what they're doing there. It's a proof. It is his way of scientifically proving that this Jesus Christ, who is the Messiah, who came at that time, is the Messiah who will come again. That's his testimony, and that's the way he structures it. Yes?
Is there evidence of major combinations in Mesoamerica?
Yeah, I'm probably not even going to try to answer that one in a long way. You have to know how to answer the question and how to define a secret combination. I think the answer is yes. I actually wrote an article on it that I think is on the FAIR website, and I'll tell you what it is. You can look it up. You'll get more information than I can do on it.
Last question.
On the lecture again, was it pretty typical that they would wipe out civilizations, or was that unique to the Mormon people? And were they really wiping out everybody, or is there some information?
It was very rare until the Teotihuacanos showed up. And then it would kind of depend on the reaction of the people. And the way that people would handle this continued through to Aztec times. And so our best model is what happens with the Aztecs. The Aztecs would come in and they would say, by the way, we're going to conquer you. Just thought you'd know. On such and such a day, our armies are going to show up, and you have two choices. You can surrender, or we're going to come kill you. And so a lot of people would surrender, and they'd say, okay, fine. And then some people would say, no, we're going to fight back. And if they were really lucky, they fought back and they won, and the Aztecs went back and rewrote their books and pretended they never went. But if they did win, they pretty much wiped them out and said, I'm going to teach you. However, no one ever wipes out everybody. There's always survivors. Even in the hill Cumorah, we know that there were 24 survivors, and we think about the 24. What we miss is that there were a whole bunch of deserters. And so there's a whole bunch of people that said, I got this really interesting idea. Instead of staying here and getting killed, I think I'll run. And there were a whole bunch of them. And oddly enough, where they ran to was south to where the Lamanites were. And they pretty much said, if you can't beat them, join them. I'm not going to beat them. So you really don't get total massacres, but you can get some that are going to wipe out a lot of people.